I think we can all agree that mummies are really old. Like, they literally haven't changed since 2600 BCE. No fashion trend lasts that long. It's about time mummies had a redesign. The question is where to start. Well, first of all, mummies are pretty ugly. They're also dead, which is a big problem. So, first of all, we need to make them not so dead. So they can actually, move around and stuff. It's rude to just lie in a sarcophagus all day. And then to address the ugly part, I don't want to just make them not ugly or tolerable to look at for a few moments. I actually want them to be reasonably cute, which could be a bit trickier. I think the first step is to look at the main element that makes mummies mummies, and that's the toilet paper-like cloth they're wrapped in. Now, apparently, the reason for this was because the Egyptians believed that if the body was damaged or destroyed, the soul would be lost. So, to better protect the body, they would wrap it in long strips of linen. Also, they would sometimes take the organs out and put them in jars. That, or they would just wrap them up individually as well. It depended on how important you were. But mummification is definitely the most iconic part of a very fashionable mummy. But I thought it was a good starting point for this new design, like a cloth or some rags put together. I also wanted the design to be small and simple, as that always helps make things look cute. Also made sure to add a dark, gaping abyss in their head for their cute little eyes. I also did try having them be wrapped in cloth like the typical mummy, but I just couldn't get it to look right, so instead I kind of just went for a single sheet instead. Kind of like if you just took a tissue, then filled it with stuffing and then tied it around the bottom. It's a fairly simple, but I think reasonably cute design. I also then added some stitches, which kind of sent me down a path of fabric sewing theme. And so I kind of tried to lean into that a bit more. I added a pin through their neck, kind of like it's holding them in place. And it also got me thinking about their environment. Where would they live? Okay, so those Egyptian hieroglyphics? Well, there was this one in particular that I was thinking of while making this. The Ankh, or Ankh, I'm not sure how you say that, but this is how you spell it. And basically, this symbol means life. But for some reason, I've always thought it kind of resembled a needle with thread through it. The middle part is the needle, and then these parts sticking out are the thread going through it. I don't know, I've just always kind of thought that. But that weird idea I thought would fit perfectly with these guys, so I knew I had to include it somehow. But I couldn't think of a way to just include it into their design, since their design is pretty simple, which is when I began thinking of including it into their environment in some way. Because let's be honest, these guys are too good to just be tucked away in some sarcophagus. They need to have a real nice place. And since I already had a bit of a fabric theme going at this point, I then thought this should probably be some sort of sewing place, with a bunch of fabrics and sewing needles and stuff like that. Maybe these little mummy guys design clothes or fashion. Now, I know I've been really critiquing mummies a lot so far, but there is one thing I do have to give them credit for, and that's their intimidation. I mean, mummies, when they're used, it's usually as a monster or something, like vampires or zombies. They're meant to be a threat, but I've always thought that was kind of stupid. With vampires or werewolves, they're a reasonable danger. There's a lot of stuff they could do. Even zombies, although they are dead, and usually pretty slow, there's still the risk of infection from being bitten, and there's usually just so many of them you can't escape. A single zombie on their own is really not that dangerous. It's the amount of them, and how they spread. But with mummies, well, they're basically the worst version of a zombie. I don't think mummies spread infection. At least I've never seen that depicted. They really don't seem that strong. At least not more than a zombie. And there just can't be that many of them. I mean, there's only so many dead people you can fit in a pyramid made of sand. Mummies are just not a good threat. Which is why I said I have to give them credit for their intimidation. Because despite all these flaws, they're still seen as horror monsters. I don't know how they do it, but they're just really good at intimidation. Which is also something I want to carry over to these new guys. Since they're made of fabric, they're obviously not going to be much of a threat. The worst thing you could do is accidentally bump into the sharp end of their needle. Seriously, these guys are harmless. But maybe they can be really good at intimidating their enemies. Alright, but now I want to get back to that whole thing about mummies being dangerous, or how that even started in the first place, which I think probably came from when King Tutankhamun's tomb was first opened in 1922, and the whole thing about there being a mummy's curse. Okay, so shortly after the tomb was opened, all the power in Cairo went out, which, it's a bit odd, but if it just stopped there, no one would have thought anything about it. But then, 6 months later, after first opening the tomb, one of the people involved died from an infected mosquito bite. This was a bit more odd, but still nothing too crazy. But then someone gifted their friend one of the items from the tomb, and then that friend's house burned down. Then someone else's dog suddenly just died, like instantly, like just dropped down dead all of a sudden. Then someone else was straight up murdered. Then over time, more and more people involved would just die from weird things like heart failure, strokes, asphyxia, and other unexpected things. Then a journalist started spreading the idea of there being a curse, which, as you can imagine, quickly became a popular idea. I mean, with all those unexpected deaths, it would kind of make sense. Though later it was thought that the reason a lot of those deaths happened was due to radiation poisoning from toxic waste that was deliberately placed inside the tomb, which does make sense for a lot of the deaths that happened, but still doesn't quite make sense for, the murder or the house burning down. Unless those accounts weren't actually true. You see, a lot of the stuff about people dying in some weird, unexpected way comes from someone who heard it from someone else, who heard it from someone else. Like, I couldn't really find many verifiable reports of these deaths actually happening, along with the fact that the whole curse thing was made by a journalist, so, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these deaths are exaggerated, if not just completely made up altogether. The only one that's known for certain is the person to die from the infected mosquito bite. And I mean, the first person to actually step foot in the tomb didn't even die until years later. Which, I mean, come on, if your curse fails to actually affect the first person to enter your tomb, I'm sorry, but that's not a very good curse. So, yeah, there probably wasn't a curse, but still, the idea of there being a curse stuck around, and mummies just kind of ended up getting ranked up there with zombies, vampires, and all the other actually dangerous monsters. Years later, after the tomb was opened, the movie The Mummy was made, which came out shortly after other big horror movies like Frankenstein and Dracula. But really, mummies are not that dangerous when compared to the others. Anyways, that's gonna do it for these guys. I do feel like I kind of went too far from the mummy direction when making them. I don't know if you saw one of these guys on their own, if you'd immediately think mummy, but they're still interesting in their own way. And the whole fabric thing leaves a lot more room for more ideas.